The first trial from the Mueller probe starts tomorrow. The trial of former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort starts with jury selection tomorrow. The charges include bank and tax fraud based on more than $60 million. Prosecutors say Manafort earned as a consultant for a Russia-friendly Ukrainian political party, which he apparently spent on everything from multi-million-dollar properties to luxury cars and even a $21,000 watch. This trial is expected to last about 3 weeks, but Manafort also faces separate charges in D.C., and that trial starts in September, even closer to the midterms. For more on what's at stake for Paul Manafort and for President Trump, former Watergate prosecutor and MSNBC legal analyst Nick Ackerman, and former federal prosecutor, also an MSNBC legal analyst, Paul Butler. Let's start with this. The basic core issues to me are fairly clear here. It's basically that he had a lot of income routed to foreign banks and then paid stuff out of them without ever telling the IRS he made the money.
That's right. Basically cheating the government out of probably $30 million worth of cash. I mean,
It's a lot.
Right, it's a lot. And what this is a tax case. So you have to understand that the proof that's going to come in, they've got to do a couple things here. First, they have to show that he made a lot of money, that he earned it, that it wasn't a rich uncle in Russia or the Ukraine that died and left him $30 million. So you're going to have Rick Gates lay out exactly what they did to earn that money.
Rick Gates, who is his deputy, who we know is cooperating with federal prosecutors.
Exactly. And then you've got to show that there were badges of fraud, that he deceived the government, that he hid the money, that he put in phony invoices, he created phony bank accounts and false names, that he did it through Cyprus bank accounts and other offshore accounts in order to hide that money. So that's what this case is going to be about, and also in terms of the bank fraud, showing that he lied about the value of various properties so he could get more money when he was really short on cash after the Ukrainian government fell.
Paul, in terms of proving this case, I mean, again, I think you've called it a paper case before, and because, you know, there should be records they have, and people close to him would basically say, like, look, here's money moving from X to Y, and the IRS never heard about it. It's fairly straightforward if it, in fact, happened.
Yeah, it is a very straightforward case. In that sense, the trial is going to be long and kind of boring. There's going to be a lot of emails, a lot of documents, a lot of bank records. The prosecutors will try to jazz it up with reports of the $3 million Brooklyn brownstone, the estate in the Hamptons with the putting green, the $1 million antique rug. But at the end of the day, it's a tax case. You know, the interesting thing is that Mueller has charged 32 people with crimes. Of those, 31 have either pled guilty or are Russians who won't be extradited to the United States and brought to justice. So Manafort is the last man standing. He's the highest level official prosecuted by Mueller with the closest ties to Russia, and yet the prosecutor said he's not going to say the R word at trial. He's not going to bring up Russia, collusion, or Trump.
That is an interesting point. Here's what Giuliani said about whether Manafort has anything on the president. Take a listen.
And he has no information incriminating of the president. I know that for a fact. They can squeeze him. Paul Manafort does not know anything, and nor could it be possible he did. He was with him for 4 months.
Well, this is the exact same thing he said about Michael Cohen a few months ago.
It's true.
That's the exact same words.
It's a verbatim.
I mean, it's almost like he's going to join the liar category pretty soon.
Right.
Just like he's called Michael Cohen a liar, he called James Comey a liar. Pretty soon, he's going to be calling Paul Manafort a liar.
Well, but here's the thing. He hasn't cooperated. As to Paul's point, he's the only one who's faced trial. I should note that not only Rick Gates, but Tad Devine, who is a longtime strategist who worked for Bernie Sanders very prominently in the 2016 and was a business partner of Paul Manafort's, is also going to be testifying, presumably about the work they did in Ukraine. I guess the question, Paul, is, as a former federal prosecutor, like, is your expectation here they're just going to go through with this trial and they'll do the other trial, and then if they win, Paul Manafort goes to jail and that's the end of that? Or do you feel like there's something else about this set of facts and Paul Manafort with relation to the larger investigation?
You know, Chris, I've tried cases that have settled. That is, the defendant has pled guilty, sometimes the day of trial, sometimes in the middle of the trial.
Right.
You know, they hear the opening statement, they hear very strong witnesses for the government, and they think, wait a minute. So, you know, it remains to be seen. If it goes to trial, it's unclear what the defense will be. So far, the public defense has been this case doesn't have anything to do with collusion, and therefore Mueller shouldn't be bringing it, but that has not persuaded the judge.
You know, there's one other part of this that I find fascinating, which is that he made a lot of money, $60 million over this trial.
Right.
That's a lot of money. I mean, their political consultants make a lot of money, but that's a lot of money.
It's a lot more than I've seen.
Well, it's also $60 million he didn't pay taxes on, which
Right.
is nice if you nice
Right.
work if you can get it. But there's also the fact that he was broke apparently in 2016. He was broke and working for free, and he owned old Deripaska $21 million. It seems to me at the core of this, there's sort of a mystery of like, what the heck is up with Paul Manafort's finances?
Well, I think what he was doing was living way beyond his means.
Apparently.
And when it came time to get more money, what he had to do was commit the bank fraud. I mean, the whole government theory of this case is he stole money from the government by not paying taxes. And then when the Ukraine went bust and he lost his job, and he still had to pay on all of these properties, all of these taxes, keep up his lavish lifestyle, what did he do? He borrowed money from banks based on these properties by inflating the value of the properties,
Right.
inflating jobs that he was going to
Because
get.
he's totally squeezed, and he's totally over leveraged, and he's got way too many
Right.
expenses to make up for. Nick Ackerman and Paul Butler, thank you both for that. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.